and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today, and for those of you who are here, thank you for showing up on a sleepy Saturday morning, and I'm sure you had many things to choose from. As it happens, this may just end up being, rather than a dialogue, a bit of a monologue, and I hope I'm able to make it interesting enough for you. Well, I did have the opportunity of working on the Triple Talaq case on the side of the Government of India, and it was a momentous case. I am currently I happen to be working on the case on the challenge to Nikah Halala and polygamy, and these are of course pending in the Supreme Court, and as far as Sharia courts are concerned, I find that at least a couple of Muslim women have challenged the constitutionality of Sharia courts in that batch of petitions. So that is pending currently before the Supreme Court. Now, before we talk about Sharia courts, I just like to preface my my comments by just flagging one serious issue which we need to acknowledge and address, and which is, I think, the abject failure of our justice delivery system, of which people like me are also a part. We are advocates practicing in the courts. The failure of it to really, of the justice delivery system to be able to really deliver justice efficiently and effectively to the common citizen. And I think that this is going to be relevant. It has a direct impact on the rule of law, and you will see how it is having an impact on the mushrooming of what we call Sharia courts. There is a very serious issue in terms of, you've all heard about the arrears and the delays and so on in our courts. There is a serious level of, uncertainty in the system, and it is a very systemic problem. Uncertainty of timelines, uncertainty and inconsistency in outcomes, multiple levels of appeals, which is really making the system really quite inaccessible and daunting for the common citizen. And this, as I said, has a direct impact on the rule of law. If the public doesn't have confidence in the justice delivery system, I think it will lead gradually to a breakdown of the rule of law, or a substitution of that system by individual judges who are working extremely hard. I mean, we see in the Supreme Court, the judges have to work, they're very overburdened, they have to work very, very hard. I think harder than most lawyers do, actually. And it's a thankless job sometimes. We also see in the high courts there are judges who work very hard. In the lower courts also, very diligent judges sometimes. But I think the problem is systemic, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's vacancies, whether it's just inherent inefficiencies in the system. And I think that this is really having an impact, as I said, on the rule of law. It's very, very expensive for litigants to approach the system. And because of the timelines are just so open-ended and long and uncertain, and therefore they resort to other means. I'll give you one example. Some years ago, I was approached by a law firm in the United Kingdom for a written opinion, and their client, the client of this law firm, was a woman based in the United Kingdom, and she was in a custody dispute with her husband, who happened to be of Indian origin, although he lived in the United Kingdom. And the issue was, the husband had made an application in the court over there asking for permission of the court during the pendency of the proceedings to take the child on a vacation to India to meet his extended family. And the mother was apprehensive, and therefore she sought this written opinion. She was apprehensive because she thought that what if my husband, despite giving undertakings to the court in England, he detains the child or breaches those undertakings and doesn't bring the child back to the UK? How long would it take me? And how much is it likely to cost me if I had to litigate in India to bring the child back? And although I am not on a regular basis a matrimonial lawyer, I find it too stressful. But I occasionally do some cases, and when I studied the entire catena of judgments of the Supreme Court, I found that just between the High Court and the Supreme Court, just between those two levels, the outer limit that I could give to this law firm, which was seeking my opinion, was really 6 to 7 years just between the High Court and the Supreme Court. This would be a habeas corpus petition which the mother would, if she had to in that eventuality, file in the High Court. So between the High Court and the Supreme Court, it could take 6 to 7 years, by which time, the child has already, grown up pretty much, and his life has been shaped already, so it's a pretty much pointless exercise. And therefore, even sending the child to India on a vacation became a risky proposition. So that is just to give you an insight of how the system is failing to deliver, and I think we need at a certain level some systemic, some shock treatment to try and get things in order and get things moving. So that was just, I wanted to preface this by, because this is used, the inability of the system to deliver to the common system is being used as a pretext to justify Sharia courts. And I would say that, ADR, alternate dispute resolution, is something generally very welcome. Particularly in family disputes, it's very important to encourage this, and this is being encouraged through mediation and reconciliation procedures, etc. Because it's less expensive, it's quicker, it's less formal, it's less legalistic, and parties don't feel so intimidated, particularly in family situations. So this is something to be encouraged generally. But the question is, should we have Sharia courts? Now, as far as Sharia courts are concerned, first of all, the very nomenclature can be a bit of a misnomer, to say the least, because they are not courts at all. Their writ is not binding on the parties. Their diktats or their fatwas are not legally enforceable. And yet, people are made to sign a consent form when they go over there to say that they will not, to give an undertaking that they will not be approaching a court of law. So that in itself is very problematic because it's taking away your fundamental rights at the very threshold point. And as you know, that the people oftentimes who are compelled to go over there, don't have their wherewithals or that level of awareness where they know that this is not really binding on us. Now, the expression court, again, it's very misleading. The moment you use the expression court, it really denotes an instrumentality of the state. It is established, a court is always established by the state, and it bears the imprimatur and the stamp of the state. Now, and therefore, by using the expression court, you are giving the impression to the party who comes before it that this is really a court which is, has some authority. And even the expression that is used, Darul Qada, for example, it means the house of the Qazi. Who is a Qazi? An Islamic scholar who has the authority to suggest solutions to the problems of Muslims. Now, who gives him this authority? That is the question. In a rule of law state, in a democratic, multicultural society, who gives them this authority? The other aspect is that, it's prefixed with the expression Sharia. So it's Sharia courts. Now, Sharia, as we all know, denotes a certain, religious sanctity. And so, when you use this expression, the ordinary God-fearing person is likely to believe that this is, some God ordained, and you will be ungodly, or you will invoke the wrath of God if you do not follow its diktats. So therefore, it's quite deadly, the putting these two words together, Sharia courts. The common ordinary citizen, perhaps in, a semi-urban or rural area, may not even, think that this is not binding on them. So it is, at a certain level, it can be deliberately misleading. And, when we look at, there was a website of what is called the Imarate Sharia. Now, into brackets, they say judiciary. It's as blatant as that. It's as blatant as that. Imarate Sharia, into brackets, judiciary. So it is giving the impression to the ordinary public that these are courts of law, which are effectively, a substitute, a parallel judicial system. In a sense, this is privatization of the dispensation of justice. Now, no one can prevent you and I, if we have a problem, from going to somebody we trust and say that, listen, please solve our dispute. That is, you're free to do it. But when there is a legitimization and an institutionalization of the system by organizations whose antecedents are somewhat suspect, whose understanding and interpretation of the law, of both personal law as well as the Constitution, is suspect, then I think there is something to worry about. Now, when we have ADR, alternate dispute resolution, we have mediation centers, but they are extensions of our court system, where mediators are trained. Most of them are the lawyers. In fact, even retired judges can be mediators. But even people who have served as judges require to go through a mediation training. There is a curriculum, because mediation is a different skill. It's different from judging in that sense, and therefore you need that particular training. And so there is a standardization. You have to go through that curriculum of those skills. No matter what law you are dealing with, there is a different skill set which is required. And therefore there is standardization of that skill set, no matter what branch of the law you are dealing with. Now, in the case of Sharia courts, which are increasingly mushrooming in India, there is no oversight by any external authority. There is no regulation. How this is being conducted, who is conducting it, what is his understanding or her understanding of personal law, etc., is not. It's quite opaque. It's not open to external oversight. So this is somewhat dangerous in a rule of law state. Now, most of these Sharia courts are run by the All India Muslim Personal Law Board, and of course, as you know, they have no statutory recognition. It is virtually, it's an NGO. It's an NGO, and anybody can set up an NGO. That some become more powerful than others, and in fact, this was one of the criticisms that women's groups made in the Supreme Court, that, these are persons who have no authority. How are they self-appointed spokespersons for the entire community? I would, rather than give my own comments on this, I would like to give you a little bit of a window and an insight into their understanding even of personal law and of the Constitution, and whether we can afford to entrust the dispensation of justice to them, particularly when it comes to women. So I will read a few extracts, if I may, from the affidavit which the All India Muslim Personal Law Board filed in the Supreme Court of India in 2016. This was in the Triple Talaq case, the Shaira Bano versus the Union of India. This will give you a little bit of an insight into their general attitudes, and it's quite interesting. They say, it is submitted that though triple talaq is the least appreciated form of terminating a marriage, yet it is very much effective and in line with Sharia law. This is, of course, as you know, before triple talaq was struck down. and they vociferously defended it in court. It, that is triple talaq, facilitates the couple to divorce themselves and the marital bond from the marital bond irrevocably and without elongating the procedure of separation. To presume that each triple talaq is arbitrary and unreasonable is a fallacy of reason. Further, it is not unknown that securing separation through courts takes a long time. This further deters the remarriage prospects of the parties. In addition to the above, in cases where serious discords develop between the parties and the husband wants to get rid of the wife, legal compulsions of time-consuming separation proceedings and the high expenses of such a procedure may deter him from adopting such a course, and in extreme cases he may resort to illegal criminal ways of getting rid of her by murdering her. In such cases, triple talaq is a better recourse in comparison to these illegal ventures. So this is, I would say it's bordering on a threat that if triple talaq is not permitted, men are going to start murdering their wives. And in addition to the above, it is pertinent to point out that it is a misconception that triple talaq is always a result of haste and is a power which is freely misused by a Muslim male. In fact, over the years, the practice in the community is such that usually the families of the spouses intervene in case of any marital discord, and only when all attempts of reconciliation fail and when the spouses want instant dissolution does the male resort to the usage of triple talaq. Now, they further say, in fact, many times the Muslim man pronounces triple talaq at the instance of his wife, as she does not want to be pressurized by her family members to reconcile with her husband during the iddat period, and therefore wants instantaneous divorce. Then I wonder why they just, women perhaps then should have been given the right to issue triple talaq themselves rather than leaving it to the husband to do. They further say, I think this is important because we need to understand the psyche of the people who are going to be running this parallel justice system. It says, Sharia grants the right to divorce to husband because men have greater power of decision making. They are more likely to control emotions and not to take a hasty decision. And various reasons are given as to why men are in a better position to take that decision. Securing separation through court entails that the weaknesses of the opposite party be brought into the public domain. Some moral failings are considered more scandalous for women in our society. For example, the charge against a male that he has loose conduct and temper may damage only a little his prospects of remarriage. However, husband's same charge publicly against his wife about her loose character may deprive her the chance of remarriage. She may be more harmed than benefited by court proceedings. Now, interestingly, there is a legislation which came out in 1939 in pre-independence times, giving the woman, a Muslim wife, the right to seek a decree of divorce in a court of law, and a secular court of law. And she had to, if her husband was unwilling to give her a divorce, then she could go to a court of law, and on available grounds under that act she could seek divorce. So this, statements like this that prevent her from going to court really is really, and it's undermining a statute and the law of the land. Then it says, granting husband the right to divorce indirectly provides security to the wife. Marriage is a contract in which both the parties are not physically equal. Male is stronger and female weaker sex. Man is not dependent upon woman for his protection. On the contrary, she needs him for her defense. And thereafter they say that if there develops serious discord between the couple and husband does not at all want to live with her, legal compulsions of time-consuming separation proceedings and expenses may deter him from taking the legal recourse. In such instances, he may resort to illegal criminal ways of murdering her or burning her alive. Needless to add, a husband who does not fear God may do anything against his wife whom he hates, for only he is with her in the darkness of night. He has more chances of covering up his crime Often do culprits get the benefit of doubt. This accounts for the rise in the cases of women being murdered and burned alive. So this is the justification for keeping practices like triple talaq alive. And on polygamy also, you see, they have justified it. You know, I could read chapter after verse on this. But I won't bore you any further. But I think that has given an insight to you. There's one thing I just want to show you on polygamy. What this is the All India Muslim Personal Law Board saying that chastity is innate in human nature and is appreciated by every sane, sensible person. This explains why one does not tolerate any profanity directed against his mother, wife, sister, and daughter. Polygamy ensures sexual purity and chastity. Whenever polygamy has been banned, it emerges from history that illicit sex has raised its head. Amid ancient civilizations, the Greeks were forced to practice monogamy, yet there was no check on unlawful mistresses. So I think you have got a sufficient idea. And this is an affidavit which is available in the public domain. It's on the internet. So it's very open. This was an affidavit filed in August 2016. And this is the very organization which has recently announced that it will be setting up Sharia courts. Now, having made this affidavit, in 2016, when the matter was actually heard in the Supreme Court in May of 2017, that's about 9 months later, they of course vociferously argued that it is, they tried to defend it and say that personal law is absolutely beyond the realm of the courts. But towards the end, when possibly they saw the writing on the wall, they said that, all right, we are going, please, the courts should not do anything. We will get our, the entire community to ensure that when people enter into a marriage, the Nikah Nama will say at the very start that triple talaq will not be used against the wife. So at this stage, the women's groups really cried foul because they said that, look, you're seeing the writing on the wall now, and when the court is about to reserve judgment, you are trying to prevent them from passing a judgment. And by saying that now you will get people to say that we will not resort to triple talaq. But in this affidavit, filed only 10 months before, they vociferously defended the practice of triple talaq. So, can you trust such an organization to run parallel courts? And I mean, while I do appreciate because the ordinary person, the regular secular courts are also, have their hands full. They are not able to really effectively and efficiently deliver to the common person. And then you have the Sharia court. So really it's between the devil and the deep sea for the ordinary person. Now, now it's interesting the timing of the announcement that every district in this country will now be dotted by them with Sharia courts. Because it came last year, the Supreme Court pronounced its judgment in the triple talaq case, and thereafter, you have the bill came, was in the offing, and finally it has culminated in the ordinance. So this would seem, and women's groups have said, that this is clearly an attempt to undermine the effect of the judgment, because now women will be given a right to approach secular courts of law, which they actually already had, but this is in the case of triple talaq specifically. And in order to salvage the sway which they have held and to prevent that entire social structure which depends on their hegemony from being dismantled, measures such as this are being taken. Now, often the argument is that, it is women who actually are 90% of the persons who go to these courts. Now, I'd like to say two things here. One, why would a man go in the first place? There is no reason for a man, or very little scope for a man to approach either a court of law or a Sharia court, because as far as divorce is concerned, it is still, even post triple talaq, it is unilateral. I hope I'm not running out of. Okay. I'll just take a couple of minutes. I wish I had been given enough time. Okay. You know that there is no scope for a woman going to a man rather, because if he wants to give divorce, he doesn't need to go to a court of law. Even today, post the triple talaq judgment, talaq is still unilateral. That's number one. And number two, even when women do go there, as I've said, ultimately the courts are so daunting. She's not financially independent. She's got to go there, because her community members, she's got somewhere to go to. So therefore she approaches, because she's the one who is aggrieved by the divorce. She's the one who needs maintenance. She's the one who's fighting for custody of her children. So that is the situation. And there's one, the last comment that I would like to make is that ultimately, this is also in Pakistan. There's this, the Jamaat-ul Dawa has set up Sharia courts which are even deciding murder trials. And it's openly being said that this is a state within a state in Pakistan. If that is the situation here, given the sensitivity of issues between minorities and majority community, then this is even more serious one. And lastly, I'd like to say that, look, ultimately, we cannot afford to, in the interest of general harmony, in the betterment of members of the minority community, to get them into the mainstream. This is not, to create pockets, I think, of exclusion or seclusion, where the constitution is simply shut off, is not very healthy. We cannot have places where, as to borrow a phrase from Pratap Bhanu Mehta, where the constitutional light does not shine. The idea of personal law flowering and flourishing is to ensure diversity, cultural plurality in the country, which is, the whole idea of India, but not to cut off the constitution and create pockets of social exclusion. Thank you very much.